Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, where I talk about cooking and often chameleon cooking. Well, things are a little bit different this week because last week I did pancakes for Pancake Day, Shrove Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday, which starts the period of Lent, and Lent is a period of fasting and abstinence. So it could be a cause for cooking things that have to do with abstinence and fasting, and I will get to that at some point. But to begin with, I want to talk about abstinence and fasting, both within the Catholic Church and also within dietary practices. So let's start with that. Now, generally, when people talk about Lent or the Catholic Church in general, they talk about fasting. They talk about giving up meat or some such, and they call it fasting. That is not fasting, that is abstinence. When you avoid a certain food, we call that abstaining or abstinence. Fasting involves giving up all food. And that would be the case with, say, Islamic Ramadan, where people do not eat or drink at all during the hours when the sun is up. And that's somewhat similar to fasting in the Catholic Church at one point in the Middle Ages, but it's no longer the case. Now we're talking about abstinence usually, and especially during Lent, but at one time there was also abstinence on Fridays when Catholics routinely did not eat meat. Now let's think about what all these things entail. Fasting and abstinence are both forms of denial, but they take a different form, of course. You can, for example, deny yourself meat and still eat wonderfully. In Gawain and the Green Knight, for example, is a scene where Arthur's court is celebrating Christmas on Christmas Eve, which is a fast day, but they've got so much fish and so many other things, no meat, but so many other things so gloriously prepared that it looks like a feast. But there's a case where abstinence has nothing to do with fasting. You're eating as much as you want, but you're just avoiding certain foods. Now, abstinence was a very common part of Roman Catholic tradition for centuries. Even when I was growing up, meatless Friday was the norm in the Catholic tradition. And at my school, we had school dinners every lunchtime, and on Fridays they were always meatless. We either had something like a quiche or some fish or some other egg or meatless dish because Fridays were meatless. that went by the board, I believe, during the reforms of Vatican II, but the Catholic Church still approves of meatless Fridays during Lent, and some jurisdictions still have meatless Fridays throughout the year. And in Lent, there are also various traditions that have come and gone. One that's still fairly prevalent is fasting on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Now, fasting means that you eat little or none during the day. In the contemporary Catholic tradition, you're supposed to have one meal only during the day on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. You may have two smaller meals during the day, but they cannot add up to one full meal between them. I don't know who makes up these rules. But let's think about the idea. The idea is that somehow you're denying yourself something you want as a form of penance. Now, I was raised in the Presbyterian tradition, and we just don't believe in penance at all. I mean, or rather, we kind of believe in penance 365 days of the year, rather than just doing some kind of penance after you've sinned or in Lent or whatever. We believe. I remember my minister getting really very strong under the collar about this during Lent one year, when he said, well, those Catholics over there, they deny themselves during Lent, and they think they're all very righteous. We deny ourselves every day of the year. Well, I mean, none of it is very helpful or instructive. The idea of penance as a whole just doesn't sit well with me at all. I mean, being sorry, asking forgiveness, and all those kinds of, that is really important to me. And making amends even, that's quite legitimate. If you've wronged somebody, and then you turn around and ask for forgiveness and then try to make amends for the things you've done wrong, all very good. But to do something wrong and then go off in a corner and not eat for a week, I mean, that just doesn't strike me as being either very mentally healthy or physically healthy. So the idea of giving something up for Lent has always struck me as a bit strange. However, I do like the idea of cycles of feasts and fasts. And this is how I think about it. I'm very much in favor of the concept of contrasts in general. If you think about any of our senses, then you realize that they exist because they are identifying contrasts. If, for example, everything in the world was exactly the same color, we would not be able to see anything, because we wouldn't be able to see the contrasts that make up the shapes and the forms of the things that we identify. And the same is true of touch and taste and smell and hearing, that we need contrasts. If everything we heard was the same pitch and timbre and volume, then we would essentially be hearing nothing. That we identify sounds of music or of speech because they are differentiated. There are contrasts. So contrasts are really important to us on a basic level. Now, when it comes to food, you can talk about contrasts in a particular dish. For example, I very much loved a dish I used to get at a restaurant in Oxford when I was an undergraduate. That was a mixture of hot pancakes and ice cream. And it was both the contrast of textures between the pancakes and the ice cream and the temperature between the ice cream and the pancakes. It was quite startling. But aside from that, I'm interested in contrasts in your weekly or annual life, and that includes having certain foods in season. Like when I used to live in New York, I had strawberries in May and June because that's when they were in season. I bought local strawberries for that time, bought a ton of them during that time and picked out, and then that was it. At Christmas time, I make mince pies, Christmas pudding, sometimes Christmas cake, all those Christmassy things that I have only in late December and early January, so that my seasonal round follows what's in season in the markets or what meshes with the weather, the temporal seasons. And we can think of feasting and fasting in the same way. If you just pig out all the time, like every meal you have as much as you want, of whatever you want, all the time, then I can't speak for you, but I would say that would for me be unpleasant. Just as fasting for the entire year would also be unpleasant. What I find quite delightful is being able to fast for some periods of time, or abstain, I should say, because I don't really fast. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm using the word fast in a generic sense. Fasting some of the time, like in Lent, and then feasting some of the time. It makes the feasting so much more pleasurable because it's not constant. Now, one of the things that most people don't realize, especially if they're not in the Catholic tradition, is that Lent is 47 days long, but the fasting days are only 40. 40 is a round number in biblical terms. But there are 47 days in Lent and 40 fasting days because in the Catholic tradition, Sunday is always a feast day. So even in Lent, even if you're abstaining from meat, let's say in Lent, you can eat meat on Sunday. So that it gives you a break once a week. Now, historically, I have sometimes practiced fasting or abstaining in Lent, and most times not. I think maybe for about 6 or 7 years when I was first ordained, I made a habit of fasting in Lent, usually following a fairly rigorous medieval Catholic tradition of not eating meat, not eating dairy, and not eating eggs on fasting days, which meant eating a lot of rice and noodles and vegetables. Mostly because I was interested in seeing its effects upon me. And one of the things that is pretty obvious is that you have to be really careful in order to make sure you get enough of the nutrients that you need to get yourself through the day or through the week. Particularly protein, if you're not eating cheese, you're not eating eggs, you're not eating meat. Well, you can eat fish, shellfish. That's a good start. And there's also amino acids in beans and whatnot. So you can do it, but it takes a little bit of energy. And you're going to miss certain things in those periods. And I was just interested in what that felt like. I never did it because of penance. I always did it because I was intrigued. And of course, Lenten fasting has changed its nature in many ways, particularly in the 20th century, when people started talking about giving up something, and that means giving up something pleasurable for Lent as a form of penance. Well, as you also know from my series on change, I was intending to give up cigars for Lent, and as it happens, I ended up giving up cigars before Lent because the shop wasn't open, and I have not been smoking cigars ever since. And Sunday came and went this past Sunday, and I could have, according to the strict law of Catholic canon tradition, which I don't follow, but I could have said, well, it's Sunday, so it's a feast day, so I can do what I like, so I'll smoke a cigar. Well, I didn't, because it would have meant riding my bicycle all the way to the cigar shop. And I'd already spent the morning riding around temples, and I wasn't about to go down there and do that. But it is, if you want to link up this week's video with last Friday's, it is certainly helpful if you need an extra push to make a change. If you can target something like Lent as the right time. Okay, now I'm going to give up whatever. Sugar, candy, tobacco. But you have to remember that there's nobody forcing you. You're just using it as that extra push. And my extra push was the fact that I now live a very, very, very long way from the cigar store. So in order to get cigars, I have to make a huge effort. So I don't advocate fasting in Lent for any particular reason, but I do advocate switching around your food intake from time to time so that you get pleasure out of certain things because you limit them. And for me, those things are lamb, sometimes steak, what have you. Again, not because I'm limited by external factors like Lent, but because I'm in places where it's really hard to get them. I will have a roast lamb on Easter, and it will be the first time I've eaten roast lamb for a year. I'll have to go to the French butcher that used to be by where I used to live. I'm going to have to get on my bike again and go down there and find a leg of lamb. And it will be delicious because it will be the first time I've eaten it in a year. I haven't been denying myself deliberately. It's just not available to me here in Cambodia on a regular basis. So I will conclude my musing on fasting and abstinence by showing you my lunch idea that I put together just on the spur of the moment, which has a Lenten feel about it because it's all mushrooms. I'm a big fan of mushrooms, and I particularly like Asian mushrooms. And I happened to find this packet of mixed mushrooms in the supermarket the other day. I usually don't buy these mixed packets because they're normally somebody's idea of what to do with leftovers. But in this case, there were several different kinds, which I like, and there were also some Cambodian spices mixed in. So I thought, okay, let's give it a go. So chopped everything up, whacked it in the pot and boiled it up, and here we have a Lenten vegan soup that is certainly well within the guidelines of the Catholic Church for abstinence for Lent. Meanwhile, like and subscribe, and I'll see you on Friday for more aspects of life and change and who knows what.